McGinn, you may call your first witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state calls Chief Gordon Eden. The sign says do not move the podium, but may I?
Well, I don't want to say yes because, wait, don't do it. Don't do it. You risk that we're going to cause a problem with the technology. They did it? Okay.
You just want to face the witness.
You can go ahead and try it. We may need a recess if something goes awry.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
You swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth on the penalty law?
I do.
Thank you. Make it seated. Please state your name for the record and spell it as well.
Yes, ma'am. First name is Gordon, G-O-R-D-E-N. Last name Eden, E-D-E-N, Jr.
Thank you. You may proceed.
Good afternoon, Chief.
Good afternoon.
We've heard your name and what you do, but can you tell us what it is you do for a living?
Yes, ma'am. I am currently the Chief of Police for the Albuquerque Police Department.
Chief, were you also the chief on March 16, 2014?
Yes.
Was that the day of the shooting of Mr. James Boyd?
Yes.
As the chief, you are the head of the Albuquerque Police Department, is that right?
That is correct.
Do you agree that Albuquerque Police Department officers are not above the law?
I do agree with the statement that they are not above the law.
Do police officers get their authority from the community they serve?
That is part of it, yes.
As the chief, sir, do you believe that an officer's unreasonable force degrades the legitimacy of their authority?
It can.
Does the Albuquerque Police Department have rules of engagement or standard operating procedures about when an officer can and cannot use force?
We have policies as it pertains to those areas you just discussed.
Are those called standard operating procedures?
That is correct.
Are they sometimes called procedural orders?
They can be.
Before I talk to you about the standard operating procedure, and we call them SOPs for short sometimes, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Before I talk to you about the SOPs on use of force, can you tell me, do standard operating procedures follow best practices across the United States?
They should.
Does the Albuquerque Police Department SOPs, do those follow best practices of those across the United States?
Yes.
Do our standard operating procedures provide for our safer community?
Yes, that's one of the reasons we have them.
Is another reason we have standard operating procedures to protect Albuquerque citizens, even those who might be investigated?
They may, yes.
Is another reason we have SOPs to protect your officers from harm?
It can.
Can an officer's decision not to follow their standard operating procedures jeopardize their lives?
It would depend upon the policy.
It can sometimes.
Yes, it could sometimes.
Are all Albuquerque Police Department officers required to know and follow the Albuquerque Police Department SOPs?
Yes.
Are all of the Albuquerque Police Department officers trained and expected to know the SOPs and what they require of their service?
Yes.
Now I want to get back to you about the rules of engagement, the SOP on use of force. Does the Albuquerque Police Department have rules or standard operating procedures on use of force?
Yes.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes.
Counsel, this is Steve from the board.
I might just remind the state that you took the copy of exhibits that you provided to the court and they were never returned.
Your Honor, I will pass you your set.
Judge, there is a book in your book and it's behind you.
You have them, thank you. Your Honor, we're at State's Exhibit number 1. Chief, is that the standard operating procedure from APD on the use of force that was in effect in March of 2014?
It appears to be that document.
Are those standard operating procedures kept by APD in the normal, ordinary course of business?
Yes, they are.
Your Honor, State moves into evidence, State's number 1 into evidence.
Any objection?
Evidence, a true and correct copy of the original SOP that was in effect at the time, and we would agree to the admissibility of that exam.
And how about for Mr. Sandy?
Concur with that.
Okay.
Is it a true and correct copy of what was in effect in March of 2014?
I believe it is.
All right. Exhibit 1 is admitted.
Now, may I have you turn on the podium? All right. Thank you, Your Honor. Chief, is it true that under the APD, well, first, I'm going to direct you to Section 252.3. Is it correct that under this Albuquerque Police Department SOP, once an officer has control of somebody, an officer believes is combative, once that person is no longer objectively reasonable a threat, the officer is no longer allowed to use force. Is that correct?
Are you referring to 2-52-3, Section A?
Section F, sir.
F or S?
F, as in Arnold.
While the witness is looking at the exhibit, let me just read an instruction to the jury. So I've admitted Exhibit 1, which is a standard operating procedure, into evidence. With regard to this exhibit and any other exhibit that may be admitted into evidence during trial, you may consider it in determining the facts. Just as with oral testimony, you may give any exhibit such weight and value as you think it deserves in helping you to decide what happened in this case.
And Chief, I'll put it right up here. And see if I can zoom a little bit here. And Section F is what I'm looking at. Does it say once control of a combative subject is gained and there is no longer an objectively reasonable threat, strikes, blows, or other use of tools is considered excessive and will not be tolerated? Is that what the SOP provides?
That is what it reads.
Does it further provide that a degree of force which may have been justified earlier in an encounter does not remain justified indefinitely?
Yes.
Does that mean, Chief, that if somebody is surrendering or attempting to surrender, an officer is no longer allowed to use force?
It could. The next line in that policy says, as the circumstances change, so do the options. Policies such as this are driven by circumstance and in any case, the situation.
Sure. But if I'm surrendering, they're not allowed to use force on me under this policy. Is that right?
That is what it says.
Are officers under this SOP allowed to engage in tactics to create the need for force or to create an excuse to use force?
They're never allowed to create an excuse for force.
And that's under... But why aren't they allowed to create a need to use force, to create the excuse for force?
There's no reason, there's no legal reason for that to happen.
Okay, I'm sorry, just one moment. Sherry, there's a juror who needs to communicate. Number 77. headset as well, if it's helpful.
Yeah, I just have an objection to the approach.
Ladies and gentlemen, the lawyers will approach the bench so that we may discuss some matters out of your hearing. It is the lawyers' duty to evidence they believe proper and to object to evidence they believe improper. It's my duty to decide what evidence finally will be admitted for your consideration. It may be necessary for us to confer about this or other matters from time to time during the trial. You must not speculate about what we are discussing, but you may talk among yourselves, but please don't discuss the case. On the left, but the jury's on the right. So when you turn to face the witness, the jury can't hear you. So that
How
may be
about this? Better? All right. And Chief, this is the section we were just talking about. Show it up here. When practical, officers must not engage in unreasonable actions or tactics that precipitate the use of force. So that's what we were talking about. You're not allowed to engage in tactics that create the need or an excuse to use force. Is that right?
That is correct.
Chief, we talked about how all Albuquerque Police Department officers are expected to know and follow APD standard operating procedures. That is true also for Defendant Sandy and Defendant Perez as former Albuquerque Police Department officers. Is that right?
Yes.
Under the Albuquerque Police Department SOP on use of force, are officers expected to recognize and utilize positions of advantage, cover, concealment, and barriers in order to maximize their reaction abilities and deployment of resources?
The answers would be yes, if it's practical given the particular situation.
All right. Is one of the concepts in there the use of distance? In your training on the use of force, are officers trained in the concept of distance to keep themselves safe?
That is an element.
Are officers taught that distance is their friend for their safety when dealing with somebody with a knife?
I can't say specifically if that's what they are taught, but it is reflected in the lesson plans.
For the Albuquerque Police Department and the Academy, isn't that right?
Yes.
Which both of the defendants have been through.
Yes.
Now, there's a list of factors in the SOP on use of force regarding things that officers should consider when deciding to use force. And under the SOP, is it the case that independently, meaning a factor by itself, alone will not justify the use of force? Is that what is provided in the SOPs? And then it's subsection E, Chief.
Yes, subsection E states that independently the following will not justify the use of force. However, officers should be alert to the following circumstances throughout their encounter with the subject.
All right. And so is it fair to say that under this policy, independently, one thing alone is not enough to justify the use of force, but these are factors to keep in mind? Is that right?
These are things that they should be alert to.
All right. And one thing, according to the SOP subsection E on the use of force, and here's the part we were just talking about, independently the following will not justify the use of force. And number one, the known history of the subject to include violent tendencies, previous encounters with law enforcement, which were combative, etc. That alone does not justify the use of force. Is that right?
It could, depending upon the circumstances. Again, this is for them to be alert to in the following circumstances.
Sure, but just the fact that alone an officer sees me, knows I have a history of violent offenses, that's not enough for them to shoot me. Is that right? Or is it?
Sustained.
All right.
So, first.
Yeah. Chief, is it the case that under this SOP, if an officer knows of a violent history from me, that fact alone would allow them to shoot me?
I would prefer to restate it. That factor alone would not be justifiable use of force.
One of the other factors for officers to consider when deciding whether to use force and what force to use under item number 4, subsection E, under the use of force, is the number of subjects compared to the number of officers. Is that right?
Yes.
And the number of subjects means the number of people that the officers are investigating
That is correct.
when compared with the number of officers who are around at the scene. Is that right?
That is correct.
For example, if there were 19 officers and 1 subject, that is a factor to be considered in the use of force. Is that right?
That would be a factor to consider.
Is another factor, Chief, for the officers to consider when deciding whether to use force and what force to use? We're looking at item number 7 in subsection E on the use of force SOP. The subject's mental or psychiatric history known to the officer at the time, where it is apparent to the officer a subject is in a state of crisis. This must be taken into account in the officer's approach to the situation. Is that what is required by the SOP?
Yes.
When we're talking about force, I'd like to talk to you about the difference between a show of force and a use of force. Are those two different things?
Yes, they are.
Tell me the difference, please.
Well, an example that I can give you is that officers have a variety of both lethal and non-lethal items that they carry with them. The expandable baton is typically seen as one of those tools that the officer has available to them. So the mere fact that the officer takes the asp from the holster is nothing more than a show of force.
I'm taking it out of my holster.
That is correct.
This is a show of force.
That is correct.
Versus hitting somebody with it, is that
That would then be a use of force.
to say, I have a beanbag shotgun? Is that a show of force or a use of force?
That would be a show of force.
If I pull out the beanbag shotgun, is that a show of force or a use of force?
That is still a show of force.
Until I fired the beanbag shotgun, that would be a use of force. Is that right?
Yes.
In the training at APD for the use of force, do you use what's called the reactive control model?
It is one of the models that is used.
Is it one of the models that was used in March of 2014?
I believe it was.
Was it one of the models that all Albuquerque Police Department officers, including the defendants, were expected to know?
Yes.
Chief, I'd like to now talk to you about your standard of operating procedures regarding the response to the mentally ill or suspected mentally ill. Do you have such a policy?
Yes, we do.
And I will say policy, but it's the Albuquerque Police Department procedural orders. Is that right?
I don't have that here.
Yes, may I approach your honor? Yes. States Exhibit 2. There you are, Chief.
Thank you.
Are those the standard operating procedures or procedural orders that were in effect in March of 2014 regarding response to the mentally ill or the suspected mentally ill?
It appears to be.
It's a true and accurate copy of the SOPs related to the response to the mentally ill or suspected mentally ill.
It appears to be.
Are the APD officers expected to know and follow the standard operating procedure regarding response to mentally ill or suspected mentally ill?
Yes, ma'am.
Does that include Chief Defendant Perez and Defendant Sandy? Are they supposed to, as Albuquerque Police Department officers, know and follow that SOP?
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, the state moves into evidence, State's Exhibit number 2.
Any objection?
Relevant to know. As it applies to my client.
Any objection by Officer Perez?
We'll join you.
Overruled, it'll be admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. And why do you train your officers at the Academy and also at APD on things that are already in your SOPs, including these regarding the response to the mentally ill and the suspected mentally ill?
I believe that part of the curriculum that is with the New Mexico Law Enforcement Academy has segments of instruction on response to persons who may be suffering from a mental crisis or be suspected of being mentally ill.
And do you train them on what's in the SOPs to reinforce what's in the standard operating procedures?
Yes.
I'd like to direct your attention to 7C. Is one of the requirements of the Albuquerque Police Department officers dealing with somebody who is mentally ill or suspected to be mentally ill in a crisis that they calm the situation? Is that one of the requirements of the standard operating procedure?
Yes.
And one of the items listed in item number 3, does it require officers to assume a quiet, non-threatening manner when approaching the subject?
Yes, that's one of the suggestions.
Item number 3.
Yes.
Item number 4 is one of the requirements of the standard operating procedure for response to people with mental illness, to avoid physical contact, if possible, while assessing the situation.
That is one of the guidelines.
And is that also one of the requirements in the SOPs?
You would have to go up to the top of that section, which begins with 2-13-03, handling the mentally ill, suspected mentally ill. It says if an officer determines that a subject may be mentally ill, the officer will attempt to respond in the following manner. And that is part of the list of the guidelines.
Why is it that you have officers try to avoid physical contact with the mentally ill?
I don't have the background to speak specifically to that. In other words, I'm not an expert in that area, but as it states, is to try to calm the situation.
And officer, I'm going to ask if it might refresh your recollection if you review testimony from a previous proceeding. May I approach, Your Honor? I'm going to direct your attention to line 8 through 11, page TR 93, counsel. So 8 through 11, sir, and then I'm going to ask you about that.
Sure. Do you want me to state what this is?
I'm not understanding this. Is this objection because of an inconsistent answer?
I'm refreshing recollection.
You didn't know? Did you ask him a question?
Is that an objection?
Yes, object. Okay.
Sustained. He didn't say he couldn't remember. He didn't indicate he needed to have his recollection refreshed.
Okay, then I need to. Thank you, Chair.
Sure.
And let me ask it differently. Is one of the reasons you have that in your standard operating procedures at APD is that some mentally ill people do not like to be touched?
That can be the case.
One of the other things that's required is that officers should move slowly and be careful not to excite the subject. Is that right?
That is one of the guidelines.
That's number 5 here. Move slowly, being careful not to excite the subject. Is that right?
Yes, that's a technique that's listed.
There's a section beneath that regarding communicating with the subject. Do you see that?
Yes, ma'am.
Then item number 6, does it advise officers to always be truthful? If the subject perceives deception, he or she may withdraw and further complicate the situation.
Yes, that's one of the guidelines.
Chief, does the Albuquerque Police Department also have standard operating procedures on the use of digital recorders?
Yes.
And we've seen more and more on the news and around the use of digital recorders. Is that both to protect citizens and to protect officers?
It can be.
Are officers with Albuquerque Police Department expected to know and follow the standard operating procedure at APD that exists regarding the use of digital recorders?
Yes.
Are the defendants, or were the defendants when with APD, Defendant Sandy and Defendant Perez, also responsible to know and to follow the use of digital recorders SOP in effect in APD in 2014?
Yes.
May I approach your Honor?
Yes.
Chief, I'm going to hand you what's been marked as State's Exhibit number 3 and ask you if those are the procedural orders or SOPs regarding the use of digital recorders in effect in 2014.
It appears to be the general order.
Is this a true and correct copy of the standard operating procedures regarding the use of digital recorders that were in effect in March of 2014?
It appears to be.
At this time, the state moves into evidence State's Exhibit number 3, standard operating procedures on use of digital recorders.
Chair, please allow it.
Exhibit 3 will be admitted into evidence.
Chief, is a fair summary of this policy that officers are required to turn on and utilize their cameras in certain situations and to turn them in?
Yes.
In this case, regarding the shooting of Mr. James Boyd, did Defendant Perez utilize his digital recorder and turn it in?
I cannot answer that question because I have not reviewed the internal affairs investigation into this matter.
Okay. So you don't know whether either defendant turned in or turned on their cameras, is that right?
That is correct.
1 second, please, Chief, you've seen the video, have you not, from the helmet cam from Defendant Perez?
Yes, I have.
Have you seen any video from any camera from Defendant Sandy?
The only video I've seen is the one from Officer Dominic Perez.
Thank you, Chief. No further questions at this time.
Cross-exam? Mr. Robles?
May it please the court? Good afternoon, Chief East.
Good afternoon, sir.
I'd like to turn your attention back to State's Exhibit Number 1. That is the Albuquerque Police Department Standard Operating Procedure, SOP 2-52. Do you have that in front of you?
Yes, sir.
Now, we're also going to show it on the screen. So, because you have it in front of you, I also want the jury the opportunity so that they can see it as well.
And Your Honor, if you switch it to defense table VGA, I believe.
I did.
And it's VGA, Your Honor, for defense table, not HDMI.
Is that working?
No, Your Honor, it is not working.
Which monitor is the one that came from the bailiff's station? Would that make a difference?
This one here, I don't think it will make a difference, Your Honor, because we're plugged directly into the system through the VGA.
Would you like to use the Elmo then?
We can do that. And Your Honor, if you would, if you could change it to the podium or the podium VGA. There we go.
What's being shown on the screen, and you also have it in front of you, Chief, is State's Exhibit Number 1. And do you recognize that as the Albuquerque Police Department procedural order regarding the use of force that was in effect at the time of the shooting of James Boyd?
Yes, sir.
Now, I'd like to focus your attention to Section 2-52-2-F. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
I'm going to blow that up for you. What I'd like for you to do is to read paragraph F, constitutional standard.
It reads, the United States Supreme Court case Graham versus Connor and other subsequent cases have established an officer's right to make an arrest or investigatory stop necessarily carries with it the right, if necessary, to use physical coercion or threat thereof to effect it. An officer's use of force is considered a seizure under the Fourth Amendment and must therefore be reasonable when analyzed under the objective reasonableness standard defined below.
Now, is this true that the Albuquerque Police Department use of force policy is based upon the United States Supreme Court case Graham versus Connor and other subsequent cases?
Yes.
And according to the Albuquerque Police Department use of force policy, an officer's right to make an arrest or investigatory stop necessarily carries with it the right, if necessary, to use physical coercion or threat thereof.
That's what it states.
And according to APD's use of force policy, an officer's use of force is considered a seizure under the Fourth Amendment and must therefore be objectively reasonable. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Now I'd like to turn your attention to a different section of the Albuquerque Police Department SOP. And that section is 2-52-2G. Do you see that in front of you?
Yes, sir.
And that's subparagraph G, and that's objective reasonableness, is it not?
Yes, sir.
Would you please read subparagraph G of your SOP?
The standard on which all uses of force by an officer are evaluated, based on a totality of the circumstances and the facts known to the officer at the time of the incident. The reasonableness of an officer's use of force must be evaluated from the perspective of the reasonable officer on scene at the time of the action, rather than with 20/20 hindsight. The United States Supreme Court recognized some allowance must be made for the fact officers are often forced to make split-second decisions with limited information in situations which are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving.
Is it correct under the Albuquerque Police Department use of force policy that objective reasonableness is the standard by which all use of force is judged?
Yes, sir.
And in order to determine whether use of force is objectively reasonable, it must be based on the totality of the circumstances known to the officer at the time of the incident. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And when judging under the Albuquerque Police Department standard and operating procedure regarding the use of force, an officer's use of force must be evaluated from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That's what it reads.
And when you determine whether the use of force is reasonable under your policies, you do not use 20/20 hindsight in your review of that use of force. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Now, under APD's policy, is it correct to say that hindsight is not clearer than perception in the moment, but unfair to those who actually lived through the moment?
Could you restate that, please?
Do you agree that hindsight is not only clearer than perception in the moment, but also unfair to those who actually lived through the moment, those officers who were involved in use of force encounters?
It could be.
You would agree with me that reality, according to your SOP, looks much more obvious in hindsight than it does in foresight.
Would you restate that? Because I believe you said according to our policy.
Okay. Do you agree that reality looks much more obvious in hindsight than in foresight?
It can.
Okay. Do you agree that hindsight makes past events more predictable than it actually was the case?
It could.
Now, you equivocated in answering my questions, but isn't it true that under your policy, hindsight should never filter into the review of a use of force case involving one of your officers?
I still believe that it can.
despite the fact that your own policy prohibits the use of 20/20 hindsight in reviewing the use of force of an officer?
As it states, it says, the facts known to the officer at the time of the incident, the reasonableness of an officer's use of force must be evaluated from the perspective of the reasonable officer on scene at the time of the action rather than 20/20 hindsight.
So don't you agree that under your, the Albuquerque Police Department policy, 20/20 hindsight is not the way you analyze a use of force case?
Giving our objection asked and answered.
Overruled.
According to our policy, it states rather than with 20/20 hindsight.
So the answer is yes.
Yes.
I'd like to have you take a look at another section of your SOP. That is section 2-52-4B. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
Now, will you please read subparagraph B?
Yes, sir. Under 2-52-4, deadly force, subsection B, officers need not exhaust lesser options of force in order to use deadly force.
So under the Albuquerque Police Department policy, an officer does not need to try a less forceful option before using deadly force.
That's what it states.
For example, an officer does not need to use pepper spray, mace, before using deadly force against a suspect who poses a deadly threat. Is that right?
That could be, yes.
You equivocate. Would you have your officer use pepper spray on a suspect who poses an immediate threat of serious bodily harm on an officer rather than using deadly force?
Again, it would go back to the situation. Again, you're just giving a statement, and I'm not aware of the totality of all the circumstances, which is what has to be taken into consideration.
So if a suspect poses an immediate threat of serious bodily harm to one of your officers, an officer has a gun pointed at him, wouldn't you agree that pepper spray isn't the right answer under your SOP?
I would agree that that's not the right choice.
And another example, that an officer does not need to use a taser before using deadly force against a suspect who poses a deadly threat.
Excuse me, on our objection and proper hypothetical.
Overruled.
Again, you'd have to take into consideration the totality of the circumstance.
If a suspect has a gun pointed at one of your officers, would you say that they should use a taser instead of a gun to protect themselves?
Again, that would be the discretion of the officer. You have to look at the entire circumstance to make that decision, and it would be the officer's choice.
In a hypothetical in which a suspect had a gun pointed at you, what would be your choice? To use a taser or to use a handgun to protect yourself?
In the description that you just gave to me, I would go to a handgun.
Now, would you please turn your attention to section 2-52-4C? Do you see that section?
Yes, sir.
Would you please read it?
Yes, sir. It says warnings are not required, but should be given when feasible. A number of factors can be considered, including availability of cover, history of the suspect, and whether such warning may cause the offender to act before the officer could respond.
Now, you would agree under APD's use of force policy, an officer is not required to give a warning before using deadly force.
That is correct.
For example, if an officer orders a suspect armed with a knife to drop the knife, is that an adequate warning under the APD use of force policy?
Could you restate that, please?
If an officer orders a suspect armed with a knife to drop the knife, is that an adequate warning under APD's use of force policy?
Yes.
If an officer orders a suspect armed with a knife to get on the ground, is that an adequate warning under APD's use of force policy?
Yes.
And there are times when suspects have been given multiple warnings, is that right? There are situations where that happens.
There are situations where that could happen.
And if you've given a suspect multiple warnings to drop a knife, would you agree that before deadly force is used, you don't have to once again warn a suspect to drop a knife before using deadly force?
That would be one of the things to take into consideration given the situation.
Now, the Albuquerque Police Department's use of force policy also contains its rules regarding the use of deadly force. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And the Albuquerque Police Department rules regarding the use of deadly force is found in Section 2-52-4A. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Would you please read Section 2-52-4-A?
Yes, sir. 2-52-4, deadly force, subsection A. The decision to use deadly force still falls under the general requirements for all uses of force as outlined under 2-52-3 of this policy. Additionally, the reasonableness of an officer's decision will include 1, reasonable belief that the subject presents an immediate threat to cause serious physical harm to the officer, another officer, or a member of the public, or probable...
So I was going to stop you there because that's the one that applies. So I apologize for interrupting.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Under APD's use of force policy, an officer is authorized to use deadly force when a suspect poses an immediate threat of serious physical injury to another officer. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
An APD authorizes an officer to use deadly force to protect a fellow officer from serious physical injury.
Yes, sir.
And under APD's use of force policy, an officer is authorized to use deadly force to protect a fellow officer who is in immediate danger of being stabbed or cut by a knife.
Yes, sir, it could.
It could? Is that your answer?
Yes, sir.
So
Again,
if one of your officers is about to be stabbed by a knife, wouldn't you agree that your own SOPs allow that fellow officer's cover officer to shoot the suspect before he can stab a fellow officer?
yes.
Now, you agree that the Albuquerque Police Department SOP regarding use of force also defines the term immediate threat. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you can find the definition of immediate threat as Section 2-52-2H. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And would you please read subparagraph H?
H, immediate threat. An articulable threat that currently exists or may happen within moments, with or without warning. The immediacy of the threat may be assessed through the following legal standards. Intent. The suspect demonstrates her intent to resist being controlled or to inflict physical injury given pre-assault indicators. Means and opportunity. The subject is physically capable of carrying out the perceived threat and is in a position to do so.
Under the Albuquerque Police Department use of force policy, immediate threat may currently exist or may happen within moments without warning. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
An immediate threat may currently exist, or I should say, an immediate threat may currently exist means that a deadly attack is underway.
Yes.
The policy also provides that an immediate threat may happen in moments.
Yes, sir.
And may happen in moments means that a deadly attack has yet to begin but is about to begin. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Another way to explain may happen within moments is that an officer believes that a deadly attack is about to begin but has yet to start.
It could.
So an officer, based on the information that they know at the time about the suspect and the circumstances, can reasonably conclude that an attack is imminent even though the attack has yet to begin.
It could.
Now, the policy also provides for an immediate threat may happen with or without warning. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Under APD policy, an officer does not need to wait until the suspect begins the attack before responding to it. Is that right?
It would depend upon the situation.
So if a suspect has a weapon and they're reaching for it, can an officer react to it even though the suspect has yet to grab or take hold of the weapon?
They could, yes, sir.
You would agree with me that the reason why an officer has to react before a suspect acts is that if the suspect acts, the officer's reaction might just be too slow.
Objection, Your Honor, improper hypothetical under the as a lay witness.
And allow the question to be asked.
Could you restate it, please?
You would agree with me that under your use of force policy, that an officer is allowed to essentially begin defensive measures before a suspect begins to actually mount the attack. Is that right?
Yes, sir. That's within the policy.
And the reason for that, according to the Albuquerque Police Department use of force policy and its training, is that once the suspect has begun the attack, the officer reacting will not have enough time to properly defend themselves. So an officer has to anticipate danger and act on it before the attack begins. Is that right?
It would be based on that officer's perception.
So is that a yes?
It would, again, sir, it would be based on the officer's perception.
So if I'm an officer and I perceive that you as a suspect is reaching for what I believe to be a gun, I can take defensive action before you actually put your hands on that gun that I believe you have in your waistband.
Yes, sir.
Now, to prove immediate threat under APD's use of force policy, an immediate threat may currently exist, or I should say, in order to determine if an immediate threat exists, you would agree with me that there has to be intent.
Yes.
There has to be the means to carry it out. Is that right?
Yes.
And there has to be an opportunity to do so. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
I'd like to talk to you about intent under the Albuquerque Police Department use of force policy. Under APD's use of force policy, can an officer determine a suspect's intent from what a suspect says to the officer, the words that are spoken by the suspect?
That could be.
So if a suspect says that they want to kill the officer, under your policy, an officer can use that information to determine a suspect's intent.
Yes, sir, they could.
You would agree with me that that would be a reasonable option for an officer to take a suspect on their word when that suspect threatens the officer, correct?
Yes, sir. Again, depending upon the situation, the one you described, yes.
Under the APD's use of force policy, an officer can determine a suspect's intent by the nature, the way they make their verbal threats.
Yes, sir.
So if a suspect gives the officer a threat in an angry, belligerent voice, that officer can take that into account in determining how dangerous the suspect is.
The officer could take that into account.
Now, if the suspect tells an officer that the suspect is going to kill that officer, the Albuquerque Police Department SOP allows that officer to conclude that the suspect intends to kill the officer.
Again, yes, sir, depending upon the situation, given pre-assault indicators.
You would agree that if a suspect threatened one of your officers with death, that officer should take that threat seriously.
Yes, sir.
And with that serious threat, that officer can understand the intent of the person who's making the threat. Is that right?
Again, it would depend upon the officer, but yes, that would be one of the things to take into consideration.
And a reasonable officer would conclude, if they're threatened to be killed, that they better be careful about being killed. Is that right?
There would be, they should exercise caution. Yes, sir.
I'd like to talk to you about means under the Albuquerque Police Department policy. Under your policy, a suspect's weapon can be the means by which the suspect carries out a threat. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And under the APD policy, knives can be the means of causing serious physical harm or death.
Could be.
A suspect can use a knife to stab a person. Is that right?
They could.
Well, a knife can be used by a suspect who intends to kill somebody to stab a person. Is that right?
Yes, sir. I said it could.
Okay. A knife can be used to cut a person.
Yes, sir, it could.
Okay. A knife can cause injury to vital organs.
It could.
A knife can cause serious bleeding.
Yes, sir, it could.
And a knife can cause death.
Yes, sir, it could.
That's what all your officers are trained about knives.
Yes, sir.
That knives are deadly weapons.
They can be.
And in the hands of a person who intends to use them against the officer should consider them as deadly weapons. Is that right?
They should.
Now, under the APD use of force policy, a suspect armed with a knife has the means to cause a serious physical harm. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
I'd like to talk to you about opportunity under the APD policy. Under the APD use of force policy, opportunity exists when a suspect is in a position to carry out their intent.
Yes, sir.
Under APD use of force policy, a suspect armed with a knife has the opportunity to wound an officer if the officer is close to the suspect's location.
It could, yes.
A suspect armed with a knife has the opportunity to wound an officer if the officer does not have a physical barrier or obstruction between him and the armed suspect.
It could.
And a suspect armed with a knife has the opportunity to wound an officer if the officer does not have a firearm ready to shoot.
It could.
So, as used by your SOP and interpreted by you and your department, if an officer is close enough to a suspect, that gives the suspect the opportunity to use the knife to stab or cut the officer. Is that right?
It could.
So it doesn't matter who closes the distance, so long as the distance is closed between the officer and the suspect, that's when opportunity exists.
It could.
Why do you answer it could? If I'm an officer and I close the distance on you and you're armed with an edged weapon, don't I put myself in danger of you, the suspect, stabbing me or cutting me with your knife?
You could.
You would agree with me that if an officer closes the distance on a suspect who's armed with a knife, that officer creates a dangerous situation for him or herself.
They might.
Okay. But you would also agree with me that if an officer puts themselves in a dangerous situation, the obligation of their fellow officers to protect that officer who put themselves in danger remains the same. Is that
It could. Yes, sir.
Okay, so if one of your officers makes a tactical mistake and gets too close to a person who's armed with a knife and is threatening to use it, the fellow officers who are there to provide cover have an obligation to use deadly force to protect that officer who made a tactical mistake. Is that right?
Excuse me, Your Honor, ultimate issue.
Let me have you approach.